I wanted to say in terms of organizations, what we always get asked is how can we be more innovative as a company? And I find interesting to look back at and understand why perhaps companies are not more innovative yet, instead of just looking at how innovative companies look like. So there's one thing that we always like to mention here is that most companies by default and how corporate best practice has worked potentially over the last 50 years is we were always trying and striving to create efficient companies. Lean Six Sigma, risk management, standardizations, these were all topics that dominate our day-to-day business conversations internally. So of course, business practices and people management and leadership rally around these concepts in a more traditional sense. So what's interesting to look at is that a company that's very efficient and highly optimized is by default less agile and also less adaptive. So it has reduced costs, it has minimized risk, it has actually by that, in effect, made itself more vulnerable in a way, in terms of the market and its ability to adapt. So that's why a lot of companies today have seen their offering made obsolete, the prices are degraded over time, and they've seen their business highly disrupted, and they're not quite able to shift enough or fast enough and adapt to remain valid in the heavily shifted marketplace. And where we find ourselves today with digital disruption, but also due to COVID-19 and so on, this has just accelerated even more and has shown up companies that are not able to adapt fast enough. So as we saw in the quote that I mentioned at the beginning, where Rita McGrath said, you don't want to be a company staying at rest, you want to be continuously reconfiguring. So efficient companies are perhaps a little bit like what we see here in the animation, left and right. They've become so tensely optimized that they're quite fragile in a disruptive marketplace. So any drastic disruption would probably make them implode, like here on the picture. And whilst adaptive companies, like you see here in the middle, are not protected from disruption and are not invincible at all, they are, however, able to shift somehow. Like in this example, it's not a functional light bulb anymore, but it could be maybe a fishbowl or a vase. And this is something that we call pivoting in innovation, to talk in innovation terms. So what's really interesting to look at then is not what makes companies more innovative, it's what makes companies more adaptive and perhaps move away a little bit from that efficiency mindset that we used to carry in business so strongly. So I'll show you just very briefly 6 attributes that adaptive companies show, but I'm not going to go too deep into the details. So if you like more, we can discuss afterwards, and feel free to contact us about this. And I'll also hand over and will ask John and Rob to contribute to this. So factor number 1 is something that adaptive companies have, is called Slack. So that's a term that's also often used in Agile and in modern work practices. And we hear this a lot from companies like Google, for example. Slack is when you allow your employees to have a slower pace and some time and permission to just take a breather and generate ideas out of their usual work time and unrelated to their usual projects. So that's why at Google, for example, they have 1 day a week or 20% of their time that they can spend on any project that they like. And in that time, products like Gmail, Google Glass, and the famous design sprint, for example, were invented. In comparison, an efficient company would define Slack as an absolute waste because it's time not spent on actually working and producing value, I would say. So that's a nice comparison to understand where maybe efficient companies and more adaptive companies differ quite greatly in their interpretation of what creates value. A second factor
Miriam,
is,
would you like an example of that that's kind of a bit closer to home?
Yes, I would love to. Please, Rob.
So if I want to fly from Australia to Europe, I have to change planes somewhere. There's no plane that gets me the whole way. So let's say I'm flying to where you guys are in the Middle East, and I stop and I change planes there. The most efficient way to get there is to have no waiting between the 2 planes. So I get off the first plane and I get straight on the second plane and I fly to Europe, right? However, the problem with setting up a schedule that works like that is if my first plane is even a little bit late, I will miss the second plane. So I have to have some slack time in the middle to make sure that I can cope with the variability of the time that my first journey in the first plane might take. So I have to make sure that the second plane doesn't go too quickly, and I have to give myself some slack. So can you see that if I have the most efficient journey possible, which is the shortest time, it's very fragile. Any change on the front half destroys the whole success that I want to happen. But if I give myself some slack, if I give myself a bit of give, then I've got the ability to, to deal with the fact that I might be delayed in the first trip and still make the second plane.
That's true. That's very useful. And as a second point, we have low bureaucracy. So I think we can all sympathize with that. And in the terms of efficient companies, we have introduced more and more processes, standard operating procedures, finance processes, procurement processes, hiring processes, you name it. There's probably a process, a handbook, and something available in your company that you have to adhere to or should adhere to and should study before you go ahead and do anything. But very bureaucratic companies also feature usually high employee effort, therefore, which means to get anything done or to get a new tool or something you may need, a new software or something you want to experiment or even approve a budget to work on something may actually take quite some time. So that time by itself is quite inefficient. It could be used for slack actually if bureaucracy was lower. A lot of energy goes often in high bureaucratic companies into dealing with bureaucracy. So more adaptive companies try to keep bureaucracy at the most minimal level as possible. Of course, they will always have some and there will always be processes, but they just strive to make it easier for employees to get their job done, or also easier for the company to deal with partners and suppliers if possible. The third point is agile structures. And I actually like John to add to this since he's our adaptive company and agile expert. John, can you say something about agile structures in terms of adaptive companies?
Okay, so one of the things we need to do when we're trying to help an organization develop innovation muscle is we've got to help them to come up with innovations as a matter of course, or come up with experimentation as a matter of course. And there's two things involved in that. There's the process and the practices of innovation. And so this is where you get the ideas of design thinking and design sprint and lean thinking come in. But probably the most important part of it is actually the behaviors. And so Agile movement has got a lot of human-centered behaviors, humanistic behaviors to bring the best out of people. So it's about taking a back step in leadership, becoming more servant leadership, more adaptive leadership, where you're actually trying to encourage the collective consciousness of your team, the collective intelligence of the team to come up with ideas. And so when we talk about agile structures, the process part of it, quite simple. It's the behaviors of how to get teams working together, collaborating together, which takes a bit of time and takes a bit of practice to get going. Is that enough for now?
Yeah, perfect. And also, I think what's closely related to that is point number 4, which is effective communication flow within the organization. In highly efficient and bureaucratic companies, we often see that information is siloed. And information is often something really valuable. It's insight, it's research, it's ability to make decisions in an informed way and in an agile way if you get it at the time when that data and insight information is fresh and relevant. Often when information is siloed, you either don't have insight into this information, or if it gets, let's say, communicated quarterly or annually in a nice report or an annual meeting, it's out of date, it's in hindsight. So while it's nice to know as an employee, it will not necessarily allow you to take any actions and innovations or product and service decisions on that data. So adaptive organizations are a little bit more freely in terms of the information flow internally. They make information widely available without delay. And they also try another thing, which is actually cut out any noise and unnecessary communication. So they communicate frequently and whatever is necessary, but they also don't over communicate. So they try to cut down unnecessary meetings, for example, or unclear objectives, lists with 50 KPIs, you know, things that people find difficult to comprehend.
Comes back to what Rob was saying about either getting data or getting insight. And we had a slight, you know, overlap there. But if the organisation or if the teams are deaf to data or deaf to customer insights, it's very difficult to innovate. You have to then rely on some kind of stroke of genius. Whereas a much more scientific process or adaptive process is getting information, transferring information from the environment, data, insights, and turning that information into the basis of innovation. Would you agree with that, Rob?
I certainly would. I'd like to point out, though, that this is a little bit like the quote by W.H. Auden, which is to ask the hard question is pretty simple. Because in effect, when you're trying to make the right level of data to happen, you do that by working out what's important and what's not important, and you're trying to make an interpretation. And I've got an example about that I kind of want to share, and it's kind of a really simple, small story, because it's really important in the context of innovation to understand that the meaning that somebody makes out of something is the insight that I think you're alluding to, John. So imagine that we have two farmers who are arguing, both of them boasting about the sizes of their property. And when we tell this joke in Australia, we always talk about an Australian and an American farmer, but they could be farmers everywhere. And you can imagine the first farmer saying something like, you know, my property is so big, my farm is so big that it takes all day to go from one side to the other in your truck. And you can imagine the second farmer saying, yep, I had a truck like that once too. And that's my point about this difficulty about effective communication, because in most companies that have high bureaucracy, the way that a communication is supposed to be understood is predefined. But what I think to expand on what John's talking about here is the possibility of allowing the perspective of the person who's receiving the information to make new meaning out of it is that thing that you were talking about before. How do I get people to have a collective intelligence, and how do I get them to make meaning out of something, and in fact maybe make new meaning out of something? So for me, effective communication flow is as much about discovering what it might not mean or what it might mean, and not necessarily in the way that it was intended.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Even when we look at company visions and overall strategies, actually research in Harvard Business Review has shown that when you ask employees what they actually understood, what it means, they find it very difficult to translate the big picture items into day-to-day meaning for what they should be doing on the job aligned to that strategy or vision. Sometimes it just doesn't translate and there's no shared meaning also in that regard. John, did you want to add anything here?
No, we're on the same page.
Okay, perfect. And of course, I think nobody would argue with this, but as a fifth point, adaptive companies greatly value their talent and have diverse talent. I'll explain it very shortly what that means. So value talent, of course, we all value or would like to believe that we value our employees. It would be nice to believe that that's the case for most companies, efficient or adaptive nevertheless. But adaptive companies give, what we said earlier, give their employees a little bit more slack. They understand that it takes time to develop and you need to learn new skills to be able to innovate or be more adaptive and agile. You need to first learn how to experiment, not just experiment. You need to experiment how to experiment. You need to practice new skills, not just have a teaching or workshop about it once. You need to actually be allowed to play with it and to safely have some experiments and learn out of them. So it's learning by doing, and that just takes time. And these companies also understand that knowledge and learning and skills are quickly out of date these days. So they say the shelf life of learning is probably a year to 2 years today. It could probably be much faster even. So these companies have adapted to a learning culture where they greatly nurture even experts that they may have hired with skills at the time, they realize that this expertise may be out of date pretty quickly, so we need to keep reinvesting in people. Secondly, diverse talent means diverse in terms of backgrounds and viewpoints. It doesn't mean necessarily diverse in terms of nationality, especially here in the Middle East. I want to make that point. Organization is very important, but diverse talent is also important in terms of inviting different viewpoints. That's the younger generation, that different backgrounds, different seniority levels that collaborate on projects together internally. So for adaptive companies to do that, they hire at grassroots, they also hire across the board, but they have also adopted more innovative or different ways of hiring even to be able to tap into diverse talent pools. For example, they have partnerships with universities where they collaborate on projects already whilst the students are still in university, to just get that innocent and new viewpoint that's not yet skewed by maybe internal company politics or the status quo. And some companies even buy whole startups and SMEs. They leave them be, they're not incorporate the talent 100% into the existing structures, just to be able to have more of this startup thinking and entrepreneurial thinking as part of their companies. So especially big companies like Swisscom, that's the Swiss national telecoms companies, have been very well known to operate their practice to talent acquisition. The last point, number 6, is an interesting one, and maybe Rob can say something about this. The shift between risk aversion and risk management. And if are adaptive companies then actually and innovative companies completely ignorant to risk? Or what do you have to say about that?
No, it's a very quick way to go out of business to be risk loving. So it does make sense to try and be risk averse, both as a human being and as a group of people in a company or a firm or an organization or a not-for-profit organization. But there's a different posture towards dealing with risk that you see in adaptive companies to more efficiency-focused companies. Efficiency-focused companies are very serious about trying to transfer risk away from themselves and onto other companies. The difference in adaptive companies is that actually sometimes they see managing risk to be a more effective approach than transferring it. And I'll give you a really simple example from some of the work that we've done with one of our clients. So Turner Townsend Think is a very, very big project management consulting company here in Australia. And
we have them in Oman, Rob. Turner Townsend. Yeah.
Turner and Townsend. And
we have them
typically, when they've worked on large construction projects with their clients, one of the things that their clients have wanted to do is have a contract clause that requires them to accept unlimited liquidated damages. And in other words, if for every day that the project's delayed, Turner Townsend Think suffers a penalty every day. And if it's 10 days, it's 10 times the penalty. If it's 100 days, it's 100 times the penalty. So as an efficiency-focused company, and you can imagine project managers like to be efficient, it was very difficult for Turner Townsend Think to ever accept unlimited liquidated damages. And it was actually costing them some business because this was very important to their clients to be able to transfer this risk. Their clients, for the most part, were efficiency companies as well. So we kind of tried to help them be more adaptive by thinking about this. And we said to them, well, how often do you have a project overrun where you would be subject to this liquidated damages problem? And they said, well, maybe one project in 10, maybe 10% of the time. And I said, okay. And when it did overrun, what's the kind of exposure? What would the typical cost be? And they said, well, it would never be more than 10% of the value of our work on the project, based on how this stuff typically works. And I said, okay, so you've got a 10% chance of a 10% cost or a 1% exposure. So I said to them, why don't you give the price to your client with your terms and conditions and then offer them unliquidated damages for an extra 2.5%. That way you make 2.5 times the value of the risk that you're taking, and your company gets to transfer the risk if they're prepared to pay for it. It has a value to transfer the risk, but manage the risk rather than avoid the risk. And what this did immediately is it stopped this back and forwards fight at the time that they were trying to write a contract with clients about the terms and conditions that neither side would accept from the other. And I think this is the best story I can give you to kind of talk about the difference.
This is brilliant because it's good for the customer relationship. It's actually good for the company because it's potentially a commercial uplift, and it rephrases a negative conversation and a risk conversation into a mutual shared risk conversation or something positive that actually makes the company money. So it sounds really brilliant, and it actually sounds quite innovative. So that's a good explanation.
So another way to reduce your risk, and Rob's already alluded to it, what I would call running parallel safe-to-fail experiments, or developing a portfolio of 4 to 8 evolutionary innovations. Because what you're actually doing is you're not too sure which innovation is going to be successful in the future in an emerging market. So what you do is you run multiple small ones. And by doing that, you are actually reducing the probability of one failing. You're creating a portfolio of experiments, and you know some may fail and some may do well. But that's the classic way an adaptive organisation reduces risk.